Okay, so welcome to the Tamid Class number 3. And we had here a trivia question last night. How many guarding stations do the Kohanim serve on a nightly basis? So we have 3 right answers. Kol hakavod, everybody. Yes, 3 places. We discussed how in the temple at night there were 3 guarding stations that the Kohanim served, 21 guarding stations that the Levites, the Levim, serve, which we will get to today. So let me share my screen so that you have the just a refresher over here that this is what we're talking about. Temple. This is the place over here where I'm pointing to. On the right side of the temple, which is the north side, if you're facing the front, is on the right, is the Beis HaMoked, is the barrack where the Kohanim would sleep at night, the night before the service, so that they're fresh and early in the temple already to start the service. Okay, so let's go back to the Talmud. We're now on to the next page, and we're on to the next piece of the Mishnah. So what the Gemara is going to do, as we discussed, is there's the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Gemara is a commentator on the Mishnah. What the Gemara is going to do is it tears apart the Mishnah piece by piece, right? In this great exploration of the Mishnah, the Gemara doesn't do it all in one shot, piece by piece, so that we can give focus to each piece alone. So now on to the next piece. We stated in the Mishnah that there are 3 places that the Kohanim serve as guardsmen in the temple. One of them was called Beis Haftinas. One of them is called Beis Hanitzutz. They're called the house, the chamber, because these were massive chambers in their own right. The temple was a compound of many buildings. The central building, but then there were many buildings around. Each one of them, could easily be as big as Shul. So we're talking about major chambers. One was called Haftinas, one was called the Nitzutz. There was one Kohen who served in each of these chambers throughout the night guarding. So what we said in the Mishnah was that they stood on top of these chambers. So the Gemara asks, I want to have some explanation over here. Yibayilahu, a question for you, a dilemma. Aliyas mamish have, were they actual upper stories? Did these chambers in the temple have a second story? Or maybe gavi magba kaliyas. Or you're trying to tell me that they were just very, very tall. These chambers were up in the air and on the built upon pillars, and therefore they were upper stories. So in order to answer this question, what the Gemara does, and this is a really cool part of the Gemara is going to cross-reference. So in this argument between the sages to find out the explanation, which we are watching this unfold, the sages on the ground in the debate chamber, these are sages that have the entire Mishnah on the tip of their tongue. Meaning, if you're going to explore, explain, and provide tradition and explanation to a Mishnah, it has to be within context of all other thousands and tens of thousands of Mishnahs out there. Because if your tradition, explanation on one singular particular Mishnah doesn't fit with the gamut of Mishnahs, then there's obviously an issue. Because everything has to connect and make sense. There should not be any contradictions between all the Mishnahs, which, by the way, is the most amazing insight when you walk away from Gemara. When you walk away from the Gemara, anytime you learn Talmud, the most amazing insight is that every piece of Jewish law in any area has to connect, has to make sense within the entirety of Jewish law, which Jewish law deals with all aspects of life. So if you're learning something about the temple, the ancient temple in Jerusalem, and there's a statement in the Mishnah which you want to clarify as A, but that clarification that you give, it doesn't fit well with a law about washing your hands in the morning, some obscure law about not obscure at all. I'm saying the divide between them that doesn't do with each other. This is ancient times, this is present times, or it doesn't fit with something like Shabbos. Then there's obviously a problem with your explanation because everything has to fit. So basically, what the Gemara is going to now do is going to bring in another Mishnah from another place to clarify what the Mishnah here is saying. Tashma, which means come in here. I'm going to teach you the answer. It's not. We learned in another Mishnah, Shebet Safain, that on the north side of the temple courtyard, Shar HaNitzotz is the chamber of the spark, as we explained, is a chamber which had a pilot light, a constant fire burning there to be used throughout the temple service, or anyone needed some light. That was the pilot light of the temple in that chamber. And it says, Kimin Achsadra Haya, and it clearly says in that Mishnah, it was like a Achsadra, which means like an upper story, a framework for upper story. Ba'aliyah Bane Agaba, and there was an actual loft, an actual upper story built on top of it. Sha'Kohanim Shemri Milamayla, the Kohanim, they guard on top from the upper story, V'halaviyim Milamata, and the Levites on the bottom, on the ground floor. Upesach Hayel Elachayel, and it had a door to the outside. So, end quote of that Mishnah. What does that teach us? That teaches us that the Kohanim stationed in these two chambers were actually stationed at the upper story, a literal upper story within the chamber. And we learn something new now, that there was a Levite stationed in the same chamber, just on the ground floor. So out of the 21 places that the Kohanim guarded, 2 of them you guarded with a Levite, with a Levi. Just one, the Kohen was on the top floor, and the Levi was on the bottom floor. So now the Gemara takes nothing for granted. Nothing for granted. If you're telling me this, you're telling me that a Kohen's on the top floor, a Levi's on the bottom floor in 2 of these places. How do you know? What's the source? Tell me what's the source. Everything has to be sourced. So the Gemara asks, Minna Hani Mili, how do I know this? From where do you know this? The Gemara answers, the Tana Rabbanan, because we have another Mishnah which derives this law from a verse in Bamidbar again, going back to Chumash Bamidbar. This is a different parsha. I don't know which parsha exactly it's in, but it is in chapter 18 in Bamidbar, and the Hashem is talking to the Kohanim in the desert, and Hashem says these words: "V'yilvu alecha v'yisharsucha." They, which means the Levites, the Levites, are going to accompany you and serve you. That's what the pasuk says. So basically, the Kohanim have the central role in the temple service. The Levites, the Leviim, which are their cousins, are a support group. They somehow support the Kohanim in their work. Cryptic words, but the sages are learning from this. What does it mean, that they're going to serve you? They are going to assist you in your work, in the work that you do and that they do with you. They are going to serve you. They're going to be secondary to you. So now, the Gemara is basically saying that which aspect of the temple service, and we didn't even get to any of the aspects yet, but we already there's an assumption here, which I'm going to tell you, that which aspect of the temple service do you have the Levites and the Kohanim together doing the same thing? Only the guarding at night. Because every other aspect of the temple service, the Kohanim do it exclusively. The one thing the Leviim have is the choir and the instruments, and that the Kohanim don't do. So we know that they do that separately. Okay, so which aspect of the temple service do they both do is guarding. And the pasuk is basically saying that in this aspect, the Leviim will be secondary to you. They will serve you. They will be as a support to you, telling me that it makes sense that the Kohanim would be on top and the Leviim would be on the ground. Because the top, if you're on the top story, you're the main guard. You see more. The ground is the support guard. This is a lot of assumptions. The Gemara is going to tear this apart. I'm going to take nothing for granted here. Ata Aimer. So you're telling me, says the Gemara, you're telling me that when the verse says that the Levim will be secondary and serve you. That's talking about in your service, talking about in the Kohanim's service. Maybe I can legitimately claim, the sum. We're talking about the Levim will support the Kohanim in their own service. Meaning to say, like, for example, in the desert, the pasuk is talking to the people in the desert. We obviously learn for all generations, but in the desert, the Levim had an extra job. If you recall, in the desert, the temple was temporary. It was portable, and therefore there needed to be a crew that set it up and packed it away for travel. They're traveling through the desert. Who is the crew? The Levim, the Levites. So the Levim had this extra job of packing away the temple and unpacking it and setting it up at the next location in the desert where the Jews stop. So maybe what Hashem is telling the Kohanim here is that the Levim will serve you, will help you out in bearing the vessels, and not in guarding the temple, because also in bearing the vessels and carrying the vessels to the desert, you also had Kohanim and Levim accompanying each other in this pursuit. The Kohanim also got involved in a certain aspect of bearing the vessels, as we learn elsewhere. So says the Gemara, the reason why I'm using this verse to tell me that the Kohanim and the Levim are that the Levim are secondary to the Kohanim in the service is in regards to guardsmanship and not to bearing the vessels in the desert, is because of the grand rule of redundancy, of absolute no tolerance for redundancy. There's no tolerance for redundancy. There can't be that the Chumash says something twice. If it does say something twice, which you see that a lot, it's telling us two different things. It's coming to add something. It's coming to add an aspect to a mitzvah. There's no such thing as just, let's just say it twice. There's nothing extra. And therefore, says the Gemara, I'll find you a different verse. Keshehu Aimer, when it says in a different verse, an earlier verse, when it says that they will serve you and they will guard all the vessels of the temple and in all their service, so that is already talking about the mitzvah for the Levites to help out the Kohanim in their service, which is bearing the vessels, carrying the vessels to the desert. I already have a verse for that. So ma'ani mekayim. How am I going to fill? How am I going to explain, to interpret the Yilva Alecha V'Yishasucha? How am I going to interpret the second verse? It can't be telling me something else. So it must be, if the first verse is obviously telling me they're going to help with bearing the vessels to the desert, the second verse is obviously telling me a different aspect of the service, which is the aspect under discussion. It must be that it's talking about the guardsmanship of the temple at night. It's talking about the avodah of the Kohanim in the service what the Kohanim do. What comes out? How does this come out? There's only one service in the temple besides for carrying the vessels in the desert. But in the stationary temple, the regular temple, there's only one service that the Kohanim and the Levim do together, and that is guarding at night. There are 3 Kohanim, 21 Levim. And if you're saying that the Levim are secondary to the Kohanim, so how does this play out? Kohanim Shem Milamayla, the Levim Milamata. So the Kohanim, they guard on top, on the higher story, and the Levim Milamata, the Levim on ground level. Next piece of the Mishnah. Beis Hamaiket Kipa or Beis Gadol Haya. So it says in the Mishnah, the Beis Hamaiket, the barrack of the Kohanim, as we're going to point out over here on the north side, was a very, very big chamber. All the chambers were big, but this one was even bigger than the others. And there was a kippah, a dome-shaped roof on top. Okay. Now the Gemara asks the question. The Gemara wants some explanation of it. Just explain to me. Was there only one guard in the Beis Hamikdash? Only one? But we learned in another Mishnah, and here we're going to do the comparison exercise. Every Mishnah has to fit. Everything has to fit. Everything has to make sense. So in another Mishnah, we learned Shnei she'arim hayu beis hamayket. The beis hamayket, the barrack of the Kohanim, actually had two gates. Echad pasuach lachel. One gate was open to the chel, which is the perimeter around the temple compound. Outside was open to the outside. Ve'echad pasuach lazara, and one gate, one door was open to the actual courtyard inward. So there's two gates. Okay. Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda says in the Mishnah, how do they enter? This is how they enter the actual courtyard. So he tells you how it happened, how it worked. There was a small opening next to the door going inward to the Azara, to the courtyard. They would go through that smaller entryway, Azara, to clean out the Azara before the service commenced, end quote. Which is just an interesting fact that this major door, talking about major doors, as we learned elsewhere, I don't think we learned it here yet, but these doors were 30 feet tall. I mean, we're talking about massive, massive, massive doorways. So this doorway was open during the day and people went in and out. But before the temple service started, there was actually a much smaller door on the side where the Kohanim would go through to clean up the Azara to get prepared, ready before the service began. Anyway, end quote. What do we see from here? That this chamber had two doors. Massive chamber with two doors. Why should there only be one guard at night? Why should there only be one guard? So Amar Abaye, the Talmudic sage says, I have a tradition. I'll tell you why. Because both doors were directly parallel to each other on either side of the chamber, Sagilu is enough. Bechad shemer, to have one guard. Enough for this side, enough for this side. So it's a massive chamber, talking about a very, very massive hall. But because there's two doors that are directly parallel to each other, if you have one guard in the center of the chamber, he can see both doors. It's enough. You don't need more than one. Okay, let's continue explaining the Mishnah. So back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, this chamber, this barrack, was set up in a very fascinating fashion. We said that this chamber, which was made out of stone, Mukaf, was surrounded in the inside, Ravdin Shal Even, with Ravdin Shal Even, rows of stones. What are these rows of stones? The entire inside was built with rows of stones protruding out of the wall. Says the Gemara, Ravdin Ma'iminu. What were these rows of stones protruding from the wall? How were they created? How were they built this way? Gizrasa the Itztabasa, the Salkabahu Itztabasa. So there were indents, there were chiseled stones, indents in the wall where the Kohanim were able to climb up like a ladder. And there were protruding stones out of the wall where the Kohanim, the elder Kohanim, were able to sleep like these bunk beds. It's a fascinating thing. We're talking about very, very, very high ceiling. So they had these like indents in the wall. They chiseled out the stone. So you go up, you climb up, and you find your row, your barrack, and you sleep on a stone, on these ledges around the room, along the wall. The Gemara asks a question, but this doesn't make any sense. Give me a clarification, please. But you're not allowed to cut stones in the Beis HaMikdash. It says in the verse in Malachim regarding the construction of the first temple of Solomon's temple. Shlomo Melech builds the temple. What does it say? V'habayis, v'havnasai. The house, the Beis HaMikdash, the temple was built, Evan Shlema, with whole stones. Whole stones. You can't take stones and chisel it. It must be they dug into the earth, into the virgin earth, and they came out with whole stones for the Beis HaMikdash. These were not bricks. They were not formulated. The Beis HaMikdash was built out of stone. If you go now to Jerusalem and Yerushalayim and you see the ancient walls, you see that this is raw stones. They weren't chiseled. You see that in many places, you see sometimes there's markings and stuff. That's the outside of the Harabayas. and also the Jerusalem wall. That was in general how they built. They found these stones, how they moved these 30, 40, 50-ton stones. No one knows till today how they did that. But the point is they brought whole stones. They didn't make it out of bricks, and they didn't make it out of formulated stones. So how can you have how can you build a chamber with a ladder like that with protruding stones if you can't manipulate the stones? So Amar Abaya, same Abaya, we have time. Baruch Hashem, welcome back. Amar Abaya, they fixed them, they prepared them before bringing them to the construction site. Avnei Zutra, Avnei Rivasa. They brought larger stones and smaller stones. Kidiksiv, Avnei Eser Avnes, the Avnei Shmoina Avnes. If you look in the verses in Malachim regarding the building of the first temple, you see clearly he brought some stones which were 10 amos long, about 15 feet, and they brought stones about which were Shmoina Amos long, which are about 12 feet, 8 amos long, which are about 12 feet. So they did it with strategy. They didn't manipulate the stones, but did it with strategy. They brought bigger stones, smaller stones, and they built the wall in such a way, big stones, small stones, so there's protruding stones, there's indents, so you could have ways to climb up and places to go to sleep, no problem. Okay, back to the Mishnah. Who slept on these protruding stones out of the wall in the barracks? Ziknei Beis Av Yeshenim Sham. The elders of the group Beis Av, it's called your rotation is called Beis Av. Why? Because as we explained, that your rotation, your 24-week rotation of serving in the Beis HaMikdash as a Kohen, usually worked with groups of family groups. So you, your great grandfather, all your second cousins, it was all families together like that. So it's called Beis Av, the house of a father, a family. So the elders of the group would sleep there. So why? You sometimes have an 80-year-old Kohen, 70-year-old Kohen sleeping on a stone. Says the Gemara, V'amai, why do you have to do this? Why don't they just bring beds? There's plenty of room. We're talking about a massive chamber. Just bring beds. Amar Abaye for the fourth time. Says Abaye, the Talmudic sage, Lav Oirech Ara, it is not appropriate and not proper to bring beds into the Beis HaMikdash. Even in their sleep, there was a trepidation, there was an awe that the Kohanim had to have, even in the sleep. You know what the lesson is here? The lesson is that that you're sleeping the night before, it itself is a service. And this is true across the board, even by us. It's not like we're sleeping in order to gain strength, that tomorrow we can do mitzvahs and we can learn and we can daven, we can talk and we can go through life. No. Sleeping itself is also part of serving Hashem. It's all part of it. So they slept in the Beis HaMikdash. It's not appropriate in the Beis HaMikdash to beds. For that week they literally slept on stone. Of course, they had their clothing with them and maybe some cushions. But the point is, they slept on stone. Okay, says the Gemara. So the elders slept on the stone ledges. Pirchei Kahuna, but the youth of the Kohanim, the young men, ish ksusasei ba'aretz, each person with his personal garment, his sleeping bag, on the ground. Pause, says the Gemara. Hello. I see here a contradiction. Not a contradiction in content, but a contradiction in terminology. Amai hasam karilahu raivim. At the beginning of the Mishnah, when we talked about the Kohanim who were guarding the temple, we called them raivim, which means young men. But over here, in regards to where they sleep, karilahu pirchei kahuna, we call them young men, but with a different term called pirchei, youth. So over here we use the term raivim. Over here we use the term pirchei. They both have the same meaning. Why would the Mishnah use two different terminologies for the same people? And I'm telling you, this is the golden rule. In a Mishnah, everything is so precise in a Mishnah. Do you know how precise a Mishnah is? That even the things that it leaves out for a reason. And the Gemara can sometimes have pages discussing on why did the Mishnah leave out something. So for sure, if a Mishnah uses two different terminology, two different terms for the same thing, there must be a lesson here. There must be teaching us something. The Gemara says, I need to discover this. Why in the beginning of the Mishnah do you use Roivim, the end of the Mishnah, you use pirche. Amri, the sages answer like this. In. Correct. Correct. It's not a mistake. Hasam, regarding the guarding of the temple, delay matula mevedavaida. We're talking about such young Kohanim that they are not of age yet to do the service in the temple. Kari l'revim, we call them revim, which means extra young. Hacha, but over here we're talking about sleeping. The matulahula mevadavaida, they're young, but they're at least of age to do the temple service. They're just very young in terms of age. Karlu pirch, we call them pirche. Whoa. What do we learn here? We learned something fascinating. That the guardsmen, the people who are guards, could be those Kohanim that are too young. They are not young, they're not old enough to enter the temple service, which I believe is 20 years old. So even children, they're too young to do the actual service in the temple, and therefore they can't sleep in the barrack. They can't be there now before. They can't do all the services that we're going to describe throughout this tractate. But guarding the temple, they're allowed to do. So we already know that that is available for the very, very young Kohanim, even though they're not of age yet, for the little bar mitzvah boys. Okay. Now the Gemara brings in reinforcements here, brings in the big guns. We're going to bring in another Mishnah from another place, and we're going to compare it to our Mishnah that we just completed. Tanan Hasam, we learned in a Mishnah, the Mishnah in Midais. If anyone was on Shabbos, we learned a few Mishnahs from Midais. Midais is the other tractate in Talmud which discusses the temple. However, Midais discusses the structure of the temple, and Tamid, the one we're learning now, discusses the service in the temple. So, but there's a lot of cross references, a lot, because it's the two tractates that discuss the temple. So Tanan Hasam, we learned in Midais, we learned in the other Mishnah something very similar. It says like this: in 3 places in the temple, HaKohanim Shemim, the Kohanim guard at night. The Beis Hamikdash in the temple, the Beis Haftinas, the Beis Hanitzah, the Beis Hamikdash. Right? No contradiction here. In the 3 places called Beis Haftinas, Beis Hanitzah, and Beis Hamikdash. V'Halavim and the Levites B'Chof Aleph Makaimis in 21 places. And now this Mishnah Midas is going to flesh this out more. Where are the 21 places of the Levites? Okay, so let's read it, and I'll show you on the map. This is going to be fascinating. 21, every night, 21 Levites, 21 Leviim were guard the temple. Hey, 5, al hey shari harabayis. On the five entrances to Harabayis, 5 entrances to the Temple Mount. Okay, so here's the Temple Mount. Now, I found this website, the Temple Institute, which has phenomenal pictures of the temple, right? templeinstitute.org, you go see it. I want to just tell you, the Temple Institute imagery, and they have many, many images and paintings of the temple and the service and everything, and we'll use it a lot, is phenomenal imagery, but it falls short of accuracy. Just warning you now, okay? So, for example, everyone can see over here that the temple compound on the Temple Mount is directly in the center. You see right over here, it's directly in the center, which is not the case. If you learn the Mishnah, it was not directly in the center. The Temple Mount to the south side, which is to the left, if you're facing the temple, was much more expanse than on the right side, on the north side, for example. So, but at least for the imagery's sake, these images can really work. So you have the Temple Mount, which is the entire Temple Mount all around. There were five gates. 5 gates. And by the way, it says 5 gates. I believe it means 5 general gates, 5 massive gates. There was a lot of the different doors and access ways and VIP entrances, I'm sure, all around. But 5 gates. So you had 5 Leviim who were guarding on the Temple Mount across the platform, across this massive platform by the 5 gates. Okay, that's 5. Daled, another 4 Levies. Al Daled Pinaisa Mibifnim. So another 4 Levies on the 4 corners of the Temple Mount in the inside. So you have 1 Levi by every door, 1 Levi by every corner. We're up to 9. Hey, another 5, al hey shari azara, on the 5 gates to the azara. So the actual azara here, you can see some of the gates over here. This is the actual courtyard. The actual courtyard over here, it's called azara. 5 gates of the Azara had 1 Levi by each one. So where we're holding now? We're holding by 14. Dalit, and another 4, al Dalit Pinaisav Mibachutz, on the 4 corners of the Azara, on the outside, not inside the Azara, not inside the courtyard, outside the courtyard on the 4 corners was another 4. Okay, so where we're holding now? We're holding 18. Echad belishkas hakarban, 1 in the chamber, 1 stood guard in the chamber of the sacrifices, in the chamber which kept the animals. Ve'echad belishkas hapareches, and 1 in the chamber of the pareches, which is the curtain, the curtains. We have a pareches in Shul, the curtain in by the ark up in Shul. You have a curtain. Every Shul has a curtain. This is reminiscent of the curtains in the Beis HaMikdash, which there were a few large, massive curtains, and there was a chamber over there which dealt with sewing the curtains, fixing the curtains, everything curtain related. Had a whole industry within the Beis HaMikdash. So you had 1 guard over there, and 1 was behind the house of the chamber of forgiveness, which is the Holy of Holies. So you had over here the Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber. Outside in the back, there was a guard over there, which brings us to 21 guards. Oh, no. Gemara says, pause. The Gemara, back to the debate arena. Everything here has to be sourced. Please explain to me where the source is that we have 21 Levim. Says the Gemara, Menani Mili, how do I know this to be true? Where is the source that there were 21 Levites that kept watch at night? Rabbi Yehuda. So the sage, Talmudic sage Rabbi Yehuda says, Misura, from the town of Surah. And some claim 2 versions. The Gemara itself gives 2 versions. Some say that this is a statement from Rabbi Yehuda. Some say it's a statement from another Mishnah. The source for the 21 Levies, the Ksiv, it says in Divrei Hayamim, which is the last book of Tanakh, and is a book that gives a summary kind of the whole. Divrei Hayamim means history. So they give a summary of the whole history in short of all of Tanakh. And over there it discusses the guards in the Mishkan, the temporary temple inside Israel, inside Eretz Yisrael, in the times of King David, times of David HaMelech. So because when they entered the land, the Jewish people entered the land after the desert, they didn't build the Beis HaMikdash for another 1,000-some years. There was much time up until King Solomon when they built the Beis HaMikdash. Until then, they still used a temporary, quote unquote, because it was a little more permanent than the desert, but a kind of temporary structure for their temple. So over there we find the pasuk, we find the verse, right? Everything is sourced in Tanakh. Everything is sourced either the Torah or the prophets. It says like this: LaMizrach on the east, Halavim Shisha. There are 6 Levites. Litzvain on the north, Liyaim Perdei Arba. There are 4 Levites. Lenegma to the south, Levim Arba. There are 4 Levites. Ulasufim, and in the extra places, Shnaim, 2. The Parber to the Parber. We'll explain what that is. Lemayrev to the west, Arba, there are 4. Lemisila Shnayim, the Parber, and 2 in the hallway for the Parber. Okay, so wow. So over there in the verse, we already see that it counts a whole bunch of Levim. Let's count this together. 6, 4 is 10, another 4, 14, 2, 16, 18, another 4 is 22, another 2 is 24. Everyone over here knows exactly what's going to happen now. The Gemara is going to come out with blazing guns. Amri, excuse me, if this is the verse teaching us that there are 21 Levites, excuse me, you just counted to me 24, not 21. This verse counts 24 Levites in David's tabernacle, temporary temple. How can this be the source? Okay, there's going to be 2 answers. There's going to be 2 answers over here. No, answer number one. Answer number one is going to be interpret the verse. Answer number two is going to be explain the verse differently. Okay? So answer number one comes from our trusty rabbi here, Abaye, Talmudic sage. Amar Abaye says, Hachi Kamar. This is how you're supposed to read the verse. You're supposed to put some commas. You're supposed to put some punctuation here, which helps us out with our counts. La Sufim, when we say La Sufim Shnayim, which means the extra places. You see La Sufim Shnayim? It says La Sufim Shnayim Shnayim, in extra places 2, 2. You're supposed to read it to the extra places 2. Not 2, 2, but just 2. Which means that you deduct 2 from the count. Why does it say 2, 2? Why does it say 2, 2? Because it's not uncommon for a verse to repeat a word to emphasize, which means, like as we would say in English, 2 at a time. 2 at a time. So it says shnaim, shnaim. Whenever you see numbers like that, shnaim, shnaim doesn't mean 4, doesn't mean 2 and 2. It just means 2 at a time. So that means you count it as 2. Says the Gemara, akati esi v'trei. So if we tell me that you have 24 Kohanim mentioned in this verse, and you deduct 2, you still have 22. That's not 21. Hey, so how do you read this? The parber chadu, because in the parber there's only 1. What's a parber? We're going to explain exactly in a second what a parber is. But in the parber, in that place, there was only 1. V'acharina b'tzafsahu the azov yasit gabe. The other one is not an official guard. He's just there for company. Mishum dekai avare, because the parber was a very much outside guarding post, very far from the other guards. So you don't want to be alone at night. So you had accompaniment, but not that he's an official guard. So you have 22 guards, one of them unofficial, you end up with 21. So we know that in the temple, in the stationary temple, there has to be 21 guards. So Gemara asks, my la parber, what is this word parber? What is this chamber? What is this area called parber? Amarava barav Shiva. So the great sage Rava, the son of Rav Shiva, explains parber to mean command Amar. It is a word that says klape bar. It's a hybrid of the words klape bar, which means on the outside, towards the outside. Klape means toward, bar means outside. So klape bar, put them together, comes parbar. So basically, there was 20 guards in the tabernacle, different places, different areas, different directions. And then there was one outside, far away, who had a friend to accompany him at night. Okay. Be by Sema. The Gemara says, I give you a different answer. I give you a different answer. Don't interpret the verse. I'll just explain the verse differently. How you get from a verse that recounts 24 Leviim to learning out that there's 21 in the temple. Lo'ilam chav dalet. The verse is recounting 24. Don't interpret it any other way. There are 24 guards. Kidiksiv. As it says, Class minayu, 3 of them, however, the Kohanim were the Kohanim. The and 21 of them were Levim. Beautiful. This is so beautiful. You know why? Because in our Mishnah, we learned there's 3 Kohanim that are guardsmen, and there's 21. Together is 24. So the verse that is recounting in the times of David, they had 24, was talking about both Kohanim and Levim together. 24, beautiful. However, the Gemara does not sit quietly on this one. Gemara says, no. Everything has to, I'm not taking anything for granted. I'm not taking anything for assumption. But it says in the verse by David, Leviim. Read my lips. Leviim, not Kohanim. So you can't claim to me that 24 of these were Kohanim. What kind of answer is that? It says Leviim. Says the Gemara, calm down, everybody. Sometimes Kohanim could be called Leviim. You know why? Because Kohanim are Leviim. They come from the tribe of Levi. They're just extra. They just have extra service and extra responsibility. Fine. But they are Leviim. As Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, as Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, as the statement of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, the great sage, the Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi once said a statement which we use many times. There are 24 places in Scripture, in Tanakh, 24 places that the Kohanim are called Leviim. It happens because Kohanim are Leviim essentially also. And this is one of them. A verse, for example, in Yecheskel and Ezekiel, Kohanim Halavim b'nei Tzaddik was talking about the sons of Tzaddik, who was a great Kohen, and we call them Kohanim Halavim, the Kohanim Levites, right? The Levites, the Kohanim are also called Levites, and that is totally appropriate to call it. So we round off by finding a great source in the times of David, in the scripture, and Divrei Yamim, for how we have 21 Leviim in the temple, and we learned exactly where they stand. And we are going to get now the next piece of Gemara. We're going to stop now. Tomorrow we're going to discover why. Why do they stand over here and particularly over here? Again, we take nothing for granted. We're going to clarify everything, and we're going to understand every piece of this mission. Okay.